The most assured way to demonstrate impact is to get as many at-bats as possible. We know we're just not that great at guessing. So at some point, we have to focus on this how do we get more tests out the door question.
What is going on, certified homies? Welcome to another episode of From A to B. We have Shiva and I'm joined by Ryan Big Brain Lucht. Your nickname's Big Brain because, holy shit, man, you're smart.
Many people say it. Many people have been talking about it.
So, Ryan, you're in a previous life experimentation consultant. Probably still possess that skill set in your current role with EPO as a marketing lead. And the reason I wanted to talk to you is I think we've kind of had like a frenemy relationship online. And I've seen your stuff. I hate everything that you post. So I really needed to get you on the podcast to let you know how much your content sucks. Is that okay with you?
It feels about right. Let's get into this.
Before we start, I just wanted to have a little bit of food that I'm going to eat. For the listening audience, that was spaghetti that I just ate.
It's an ASMR podcast. If that's what this is, then I'm out. Like, I feel like I'm being baited here.
See, I ate the spaghetti. I didn't throw it at the wall and saw what stuck. I put it in my tummy, and it was very delicious. It was a homemade pumpkin coconut milk. I don't know. It was delicious. So, I like to eat spaghetti instead of, you like to throw it at the wall.
Yeah.
And just see if it sticks. It feels wasteful,
It's fun to play with your food.
Okay, obviously I'm uber trolling. So I think the purpose of what I wanted to talk to you about this, or a topic I wanted to talk to you about was, let's just say this. I think there's a conversation being had around, should you test everything? Probably. I think that's probably really good advice. But can you test everything? And what are the logistics of testing everything? And that kind of relates to spaghetti testing, which maybe let's start with that first. Spaghetti testing. Ryan, what does spaghetti testing mean to you? What is it?
Well, depending on how strong of a prior you're bringing to the conversation, spaghetti testing might mean any test you're running that doesn't have some sort of grand strategic narrative behind it, or it's not research-backed, or it's just an off-the-cuff idea without some broad justification for it. You're just testing it to test it, or just on a hunch that you think it might work.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's just, if you can do it, do it. And it's called spaghetti testing because it's metaphorically, if you throw spaghetti at the wall and you would hope that some of it would stick. That's kind of the idea of like metaphorically throwing spaghetti at the wall, throwing tests at the wall and see if something sticks.
You're trying it just to try it. Let's just see what happens. Maybe you don't even think it's going to work. Maybe you're trying it because you think it's not going to work and you're just seeing if there's an off chance that you're going to prove yourself wrong.
That's interesting. I guess theoretically in that case, you would have evidence to prove that it's not going to work.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe it's just a gut feel. Think about how many things we take off our plate or deprioritize just because we think it has a low chance of success, right? How do people prioritize tests? Impact, confidence, ease, whatever. Okay, cool. I gave this thing a low confidence score. That means I'm never going to test it. And what I'm saying is maybe just try the thing even though you have low confidence in it.
Yeah, so this is actually more of a broader conversation around prioritization frameworks too then. What is your stance on prioritization frameworks?
To me, they're a necessary evil. That's the hot take version, just because I kind of loathe how subjective they are. And the whole reason I love experimentation is because I love how often it proves us wrong, right? And proves our instincts wrong. And all that prioritization noise is just instincts. And it takes a surprisingly long time to put it on paper or to like discuss internally for something that's just instinct at the end of the day. Obviously, there's some necessity to it, right? Like we can't just have complete chaos and anarchy. There has to be some like order of operations to what we're trying on the site. What my rallying cry is with all the spaghetti testing stuff is set aside some portion of your time and forget the prioritization model. Just try whatever's on the backlog, regardless of what it scores.
So there's a lot of perspectives here, and I don't agree or disagree with anything that you've said so far. When we talk about prioritization frameworks, and that kind of relates to this whole conversation, Prioritization frameworks are generally in place because you can't test everything at the same time all at once. From just a pure logistical perspective, like it is a near impossibility. So prioritization comes in with, let's just say RICE, with reach, impact, confidence, effort. I think for the purposes of this conversation, my focus is on the E piece, the effort piece.
Yep.
Because I think a lot of times in my prioritization framework, which I think we could, I think I challenge your assertion that prioritization frameworks are subjective. I think many parts are subjective. Like definitely, what's the projected impact? Who fucking knows? Plus 3%, minus, it's guess. Totally fair. And to your point, that's why we test it. We don't know. So we're guessing and we want to try and see what happens. And I don't know how many times have you had a projected test impact that has not reached your projected impact. So that is kind of a flaw with the prioritization framework. I think that's so right. But on the effort piece, I think that's where I have struggled so mightily.
Sure.
And my perspective on this is effort, what goes into effort, like design effort, engineering effort, brand effort, copy effort, like my effort, I'm valuable. I'm expensive and I'm valuable. So my time should be put into things that are high ROI, high impact. My effort should be offset by the high impact things that we could do. I mean, effort's an important part of the conversation that there are no unlimited resources at any company.
Sure. Yeah. And we can get into this a little bit too, but effort is actually the one that I think is still useful too, only because I think at the end of the day, the only thing that's really in our control is how much it costs to run an experiment. And if the meta level work of running an experimentation program, so everything that's not the actual tests themselves, everything from advocating for the program internally to winning more resources to choosing the right tooling, the right team members, whether they be official in capacity or unofficial, all of that work, the goal with that should be to decrease our cost per experiment. Because the thing that we can't control, or at least I'm convinced we can't control it, and if someone listening feels otherwise, I would love for you to prove me wrong. I just don't think any company ever has, is the distribution of outcomes. There's some variance, but as far as I'm aware, every single company that's run enough tests ends up somewhere in the vicinity of maybe a third of the things they try work out, maybe a third have no measurable impact, and maybe a third lose. Smaller impacts, win or loss, are more common than very large impacts. If you are some, magic exception to that, you figured out some sort of crystal ball that lets you have a 60% win rate over a lot of experiments, the scientific community needs to study you, right? But no one's been able to document that to date. So I'm not interested in trying to expend a lot of effort on prioritization to shift my win rate a couple percentage points. But ease is meaningful signal, right? Because if we can decrease our cost per test, then we can run more tests and find more wins, which is what we're trying to do at the end of the day. That said, even ease is a case of all models are wrong, some models are useful, right? Because maybe something like a copy change could be super easy to implement, but if there's 5 internal stakeholders who are going to make you get on an hour-long Zoom call and argue until the cows come home about is this in our brand voice or whatever, that's not actually easy. And there are things that you can do to increase how easy a test is, again, on that meta level. Right? Maybe I can't make this copy test easier, but we could have a hard conversation internally and put some processes in place that will make future copy tests easier. And that work is really valuable and what you and I as experimentation program leaders need to do. But I've digressed at this point. I don't disagree with you. Ease is valuable signal. But to what end? Is it about a single test or is it about making sure that we're increasing our capacity over time?
I think the biggest takeaway from how I think you're approaching this is that at some point when you're running tests, one of the biggest focal points should be in your program, making tests cheaper to run.
Yes.
As much as you could do it, make them cheaper to run. I think that's something you talk a lot about at EPO. I think that's what a lot of Valprop for testing tools like EPO and other companies, that's what they're trying to talk more about is at some point you've reached maturity that running individual tests costs a lot of money. Make it cheaper so you could run more and validate more, test more. The more kicks at the can you get, the higher chance you have of actually hitting impactful things, even if it is spaghetti testing. Is that a fair assessment of kind of what, or summary of kind of what you said?
Yeah, and it has less to do with the tooling or vendors and more to do with just that is the mathematical property of the distribution of outcomes that we all observe, right? If that's true, if the world that we operate in is that small impact more likely than large, and a third, whatever. It could be 20, 40, I don't know. But if it's anywhere in that vicinity, then just mathematically speaking, the optimal thing to do is to run as many experiments as possible. So then the entire game becomes about how do we get there? It's not about how do we carefully select the right tests to run because we have a limited number of at-bats and we want to try to hit home runs every time. It's about how do we get up to the plate more?
Yeah, that's true. I want to add nuance to this because in theory, I think I agree, but I also disagree when it comes to specific segments of how you're.
Okay.
I think you're overgeneralizing. I want to break out the conversation into like low, mid, high maturity companies. I think if we talk about super high maturity companies like Airbnb, Amazon, Walmart, whatever, Booking. All these companies have hyper-optimized, hyper-focused, robust processes, cheaper tests than most. That machine is so finely tuned, but they also drive so much traffic and they have such a robust, mature experimentation program with resources that being able to detect small changes, and their programs are so optimized that finding a 20% conversion rate lift is hard. Generally speaking, from my observation, what I've seen is lower maturity experimentation companies or just lower maturity digital marketing companies have tended to be like cookie cutter websites, like the people who are just using Unbounce to just build a landing page based off best practice shit that they saw, right? Like the upside for those pages is incredibly high because they are so unoptimized. And there's a correlation between those unoptimized pages and the unoptimized lack of maturity and then the opportunity to actually reach a 20% lift to conversion rate. While, maybe not, you shouldn't expect it. It can happen more likely in the smaller, unoptimized, less mature than the higher. The catch-22 is the not mature, smaller companies don't have the resources like the bigger companies to maybe fund something that could achieve that. I don't really have a question here. I just kind of like made a statement. I'm curious what you think about that.
I think this whole distinction is a little overblown, honestly. I think there are some obvious differences, right? Amazon, whoever, they have teams of PhD economists who can run like really advanced, crazy experiment designs, like things that you and I would never consider in our day-to-day, probably. I guess here's my question to you. How do you think a low maturity company becomes a high maturity company?
It needs to feed the cycle to get better. But let me, I kind of see where you're going with this. Let me use an analogy. If Michael Jordan came in and taught kindergartners how to play basketball, that is, and maybe you disagree with the analogy, but follow me on it for a second. I'll take the challenge in a sec. If Michael Jordan came in as like giving you these drills for kindergartners on how to play basketball, yeah, Michael Jordan is at the best of his game. But where he's at in terms of his own maturity, in terms of skill, and the drills that he does and the stuff that he does, I don't think a kindergartner can tangibly learn anything from that person other than have a goal to reach that level. I don't want to say definitively they can't learn anything from that person. I think they learn a lot less compared to people who are in the trenches doing it. I think like someone in a no maturity can learn from a low to mid maturity. Someone in a low maturity could probably learn from a mid to mid high. And then like you learn from the people that are like a couple rings above you. Versus if someone rich comes up to you and tells you got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, the worst useless fucking advice anyone has ever given anyone in their entire life.
It's impossible to actually pull yourself up by bootstraps. That's the irony of that saying.
There's a lot of things wrong with that statement of someone who's well endowed telling someone else to do that. But that's my challenge to that kind of thinking.
I don't think it's like that. And here's why. Like very early in my experimentation career, I thought the same thing, right? I figured Microsoft became that way because their CEO was someone technical. It was Bill Gates. And surely just because they were scientists and understood the scientific process, they got experimentation and baked it into the company from the start. And that's how they became this mature experimentation org. And maybe like there are a couple outliers that are like that, like Amazon. Jeff Bezos seems to have always been really big on experimentation. Scott Cook at Intuit comes to mind. But that's not the Microsoft story at all. The Microsoft story, starts with Ronnie Kohavi kind of building a beachhead at Bing and fighting a really hard uphill battle over years and years and years to try and get experimentation into other parts of that business. And even then, it didn't really happen until Satya became CEO, because Satya had run Bing and seen the experimentation thing firsthand. At some point, the experimentation growth journey is really about one or a handful of like transformational leaders, like people who believe in the experimentation thing and are willing to stick their neck out a little bit and say, like, advocate in the way that they need to advocate to build a program. Because here's the reality. Whether you're at an agency or a vendor or in-house at a small company, in-house at a big company, like collectively, we are all still early adopters of this experimentation thing. The majority of companies and the majority of our colleagues don't have that buy-in yet where, oh, this is like an obvious thing we should be doing and I totally get it. And the chasm from early adopter to early majority, famously really tough to cross. So the journey from being a low maturity experimentation org to a high maturity one, always going to be an uphill battle. And it's always going to require someone like you to kind of make that push. But there's no magic overnight like, suddenly we have all this money and headcount and tooling for experimentation. It's won over time by demonstrating impact. And the most assured way to demonstrate impact is to get as many at-bats as possible. We know we're just not that great at guessing. So at some point, we have to focus on this how do we get more tests out the door question.
I think everything you're saying sounds good in theory, but I want to try and add some practicality from my perspective. This, again, by the way, this is all my perspective, guys. Like, I'm not saying anything I'm saying is fact. It's just the challenges that I've just personally faced throughout this whole fun, wonderful world of experimentation journey. You were talking a lot about Ronnie Kohavi's fight into basically shouting from the rooftops, experimentation fucking matters. We need to do more of it. And starting at Bing, proving its worth, scaling it out. But you even rightfully said they needed someone in that senior leadership level to come in and push that down. I know Manuel da Costa talks a lot about this, where like, you need executive sponsorship for experimentation. You need that authority, autonomy, and accountability and responsibility, all of the big illity words to like do something with it. In experimentation maturity models, at least the ones I worked at Spiro, one of the biggest ones is effectively politics. Do you have leadership buy-in? Do you have that? That was one of the biggest challenges I see in all my experimentation roles. And let me pose this question to you. I might be leading you into this question as I've said all of these things, but a statement I will make and then have you react to it rather than ask you a question is, I think the biggest limiting factor in growing experimentation programs is just politics. It's someone coming in, blocking the growth of the program, not understanding what they do, not funding it. It's people. It's not a process thing. It's not make experimentation cheaper. That's like 3 steps, because the step 1 is they don't even believe in the value. They don't get it. They don't see it. And in order to, maybe it's almost like a catch-22 of like, it's a catch-22.
You're getting there. You're so close.
What's the other word? What's the right word?
No, catch-22. But continue your thought, because like I think you're about to land on exactly the next thing that I would say.
On your point, I kind of was there. It was like, fuck, did I just prove his point? Because like you need a lot of cracks at bat to prove the value of experimentation. I think that's your point.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about it. How do you get that executive buy-in? Because like I said, almost never does it just like come like a gift from the heavens.
Can I take a step back?
Sure.
You're asking how do you get that executive buy-in? I'm going to challenge and say, can you get that executive buy-in?
Maybe not all the time. I mean, there's a saying like B2B marketing, right? Like life is too short to work for a CEO who doesn't get marketing. That's not always true, though, to be clear. Like some people rightfully say like that is way too reductionist of a viewpoint to have. And if you can't make it work, then that says something about you and your like ability to lead upwards. So it's not like a black and white thing. And I don't mean to portray that, but go ahead.
We went into an episode with Shrek, i.e. Michael Agard, a couple episodes ago about you might be the problematic CRO. And totally fair. It might be that you're just like, fuck you, CEO. And he's like, I pay your paycheck. You just go away. Like, if you're an asshole, they could just let you go. But I think maybe this is a more meta point around like, just because you don't have everything in place for the best experimentation program, it doesn't mean, and I think you probably agree with this, just because you don't have everything pixel perfect exactly the way it needs to, doesn't mean experimentation can't still make an impact, albeit you probably have a lot of frustrated CROs in those roles. But just because you're not testing everything, just because, to your point, you might have an easy copy test that you have 5 brand people are like, nope, we're gonna do all the shit to it and make it take 7 months to do a copy test. But just because you have all this like roadblocks in place, if you're still running tests, that's still better than not. And you might be not testing everything. Testing something is better than testing nothing.
Yes, and just because we are not highly resourced and we have to be scrappy doesn't mean that we can't take cues from companies that are highly mature. Like, I think that's what's frustrating to me So here's another catch-22, right? Is to explain what successful experimentation programs look like. Anyone like myself or any author, podcast, or whatever is often citing stories from these massive tech companies. And part of that is like the perceived credibility thing, right? Like we all want examples of companies who were ultimately successful. You know, obviously not totally because of the experimentation program, but we can, you know, weave a narrative that it was important. But also like part of it is just like those are the examples that are available to cite, right? Like smaller companies or smaller teams don't have the time or permission to publicly publish their work like that. So we kind of end up with the only people we can point to are the Microsofts and Amazons and Airbnbs of the world. But the problem it creates is it means that someone who's maybe at a lower maturity company or earlier in their career looks at that and says, well, I could never do that. That's not me. There's no one like me doing this thing. And I just don't think that's true, right? Just because we can't test everything doesn't mean we can't set aside one test out of 10 to try something random. And just because the stories of random things working out in extremely profitable ways come from Bing and come from Airbnb does not mean that it won't be true for your site as well.
I think you're taking a good middle ground that I don't disagree with. I think you're saying don't blindly do what everyone else is doing at the bigger companies, because the way they've set things up, the way they've approached it is unique to Microsoft, is unique to these companies with their resources and their leadership and, you know, everything there. That doesn't mean there's maybe some lessons we can't learn, but I think you're rightfully taking the baseline of where CROs are at and saying, like, I think you should stop complaining, like in a nice way. Like you're saying, stop complaining and figure out the levers you could pull to improve on your maturity. It might not be every single possible thing, but these big companies, like Ronnie Kohavi didn't just jump into Microsoft and just have everything handed to him on a silver platter, right? Like he fought for it. You have to fight to get more, and it's not an easy fight, and it sucks because you would wish or hope in a perfect world that a CRO can come into their role and effectively have some structure in place that they could do the CRO work.
Yeah, I'm saying take control of your career growth a little bit, right? You know, even if you're very junior and new to this space, the fact that you have a job, whether CRO is your title or not, someone had to go to bat for that headcount and make a business case that we should have a full-time role called XYZ and we should pay this salary for it, and you ended up in that role. To win more resourcing for the experimentation program, it's going to be the same story. There has to be a business case made. And again, because we're early in this adoption curve, a lot of companies are not going to make that investment just on faith. They're going to have to see some results. It can't just be, this is the Microsoft story, this is the Amazon story. It has to be, here are the tests that we ran inside our company and the things we learned and the metrics we moved. And if you want the CEO to believe that and buy into it, then you better be reporting on the exact metrics that he or she thinks about every night, right? It can't be the website conversion rate. It can't be clicks on the button. It has to be revenue. It has to be, even better would be profit, right? Especially if you're like a retailer and you have different margins on different products. It's not always the case, right? Because like profit can be very difficult to report on in an experiment if you don't have the right data stack. But to bring some examples from my consulting days, right? Like I worked with a notable gym chain, and the CEO, like the really leading indicator he looked at for the health of the business was new member joins. How many new membership enrollments are we getting? And we made sure that all the tests we were running on their site could be reported on lift to joins. If you want to grow your career, which again, you don't have to want that. Not everyone is like the super achievement driven psycho like me, and that's fine. But the reason I keep harping on this early adopter thing is that there might be fields for you to work in that are less frustrating than experimentation, if that's not you. But if you relish that uphill battle and that challenge, the roadmap is there. You're just going to have to stick your neck out a little bit.
This is really good pushback and kind of a kick in the ass for CROs, because a couple episodes ago, we were talking with Michael, like sometimes you might be the shitty CRO and we should hold ourselves to a high standard in our role, what we do, how we talk about people, how we talk with people, how we work with people. I think in the same way, Ryan, you're giving me a personal kick in the ass for someone who probably needs it, to be like, we can't just sit and complain all the time, right? There is a level of fight that we have to have. I think there's probably there's an understanding that you have to fight in the right place.
Yep,
That
sure.
you have to hope that at some point your fighting actually pays off with an organization that even with politics will reward you. Maybe you don't get the whole piece of the whole pie, but you get a little slice. And you have to know that your efforts and stuff is warranted. This has honestly been a little bit motivational for me, a lot of it motivational for me, as someone who is in a solo CRO role, to be like, I gotta fight. I know it's like, you could get exhausted, you could get tired, you could be like, I'm fighting all the time, I'm working all the time, this sucks. I just want to do my job. But like, at a certain point, yes, you do have to fight for what you want, because you're not going to become Michael Jordan without, fighting a little bit. So I think this is really great and motivational for me personally. I hope other listeners take this away too.
Sure. Well, let me say, I hope that I could be a cheerleader in this as much as an ass kicker, right? And it, like you said, it requires persistence. And if at the end of the day it doesn't work out, it's not just about you, right? There are plenty of dysfunctional, toxic companies in the world. I do not mean this to be a value judgment on anyone who's in that CRO seat, but there are a lot of ways to advocate for experimentation, right? It's not just about the results. Like Ronnie famously hung posters up all around the Microsoft campus to promote the experimentation platform. Or I have a customer champion at Eppo who really started to build the experimentation culture by spamming Slack every time PMs would announce a new feature release. He would start a thread and be like, "This looks so awesome. Where are the experiment results for this?"
It's so passive aggressive.
Just without, just constantly checking. Yeah. But that's what I mean. It requires a little creativity. It requires sticking your neck out a little bit. But if you don't have the conviction in experimentation that makes you willing to do that, I'm not saying go find another job, but for your own sanity, there are probably things that would be less frustrating to do. Maybe just take a UX designer title if that's the part of experimentation you really love, or take a digital marketing title.
That sucks.
It's not
you're
depressing.
Gonna go into experimentation. It's gonna suck. You gotta fight like hell all the time. You're probably not gonna get what you want.
That's the job of being an innovator, though. And that's what everyone doing the job is now. And you can still run experiments as a marketing manager. You can still run experiments as a product manager, as a designer, whatever. But if you love the experimentation thing so much that you want a dedicated experimentation title, you want that to be 100% of your job, just know what you're signing up for. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, it's a lot easier for me to say this as a person with a mic, just to say, hey, you should just fight harder and work harder. But also, I am a person who has a CRO role, who's in the trenches doing this too. So I want to, before we go into shit you need to know, I want to pose this final hypothetical question, scenario, role play,
sure,
buzzwords, whatever the fuck this is going to be. This is what it is. I am a single CRO. I am, meaning the only CRO person on a team within, let's just say, a marketing team. I'm the only person. I am drowning in work because the work that I have to do is coordinate and communicate and strategize with designers, coordinate, communicate, strategize with engineers, coordinate, communicate, strategize with the web analyst marketing team, with my boss and their boss, brand, social teams. I also de facto got thrown in web analytics onto my plate and managing the data architecture infrastructure. You're laughing. This is my life.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'm laughing because I know how common that is. To be clear, I hate that shit. There are people who are so good at Google Analytics and whatever. I was never that person. I never will be. That was honestly part of the reason that I was I think the vendor space would be really fun for me to play in, is because consulting, there were so many asks like that where I was this is just not my zone of genius. I'm trying to make the case for experimentation all day. So I feel for you. I really do.
So I'm going to continue along this terrible journey that I'm on right now.
Yeah.
Resources are not unlimited. They're very expensive.
Yeah.
Experiments are not cheap because it requires my strategizing time, engineering strategizing time. We do use a prioritization framework. There are times where we just blow it off because the leadership comes in and is like, I want to run this test and do it. Which honestly, I'm thrilled that they're like, we want to test it rather than we're just going to do this shit and launch it. So take the wins when you can, take the positivity when you can. But what I've just described is I think a lot of solo CROs are in this situation. And I had Stuart on last year to kind of discuss these same things. What's the hardest thing to scale from? 0 to 1 or 1 to 5 tests or 5 to 10, And I pose this question. I think for me, one of the hardest things is getting from 0 to 1, but that doesn't make 1 to 5 easy, or 5 to 25 easy. They're all hard with different challenges.
Yeah.
So I'm describing this scenario because I think there's a lot of people who might be listening to this who are maybe at that 0 to 1 trying to get to this one test or trying to scale this up more. And you know that meme of like that person who's drowning and then someone high fives them and then they drown all the way? That is effectively what it feels like a lot of times from me, from my perspective. That's what it feels like a lot of times when I read like Microsoft, Amazon, Walmart, Booking, they're doing these amazing things. I'm like, that's cool. I couldn't get one test last month because I didn't have any of this. So it's like rich people talking about rich people problems and then rich people saying, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. So that's a long story. The actual question I'll pose here is, there are things that we can learn from these bigger companies. But if I'm in that scenario where I'm drowning and it's like, I don't even have the time to think, to strategize, to spend like a quarter making experiments cheaper, what can I actually learn from these bigger companies?
It's a good question. You know, honestly, I think the things to learn actually at that stage don't have to do with experimentation so much. Like, I think what you need is not some magic analysis method or the winning test idea or even the winning roadmap. I think what you need most is allies. And that could start with your manager, right? They made a case for your headcount. They are responsible for your output as part of their organization. So they are incentivized to help you get the resourcing you need. But it could be a designer, or it could be an engineer who has a lot of ideas on how to improve the product or the site that they get frustrated aren't getting tried. You need to find people that have that like spark of the experimentation spirit a little bit, even if they don't have all the know-how and it's not their job. People who are curious and help get them some degree of autonomy, right? If you can find a UX designer who has a lot of ideas, I want to try and tell them, hey, anything you design, we will test it. That's super powerful, right? You need to like beg, borrow, and steal attention and interest from those places in the org. And then the other thing too is like what you would do in any role when you're overwhelmed is a bit of a time audit, right? Like, where is my time actually going? And what do I need to start saying no to make room for the things that are being impactful? None of this is experimentation specific advice. You know, this is just kind of like how you achieve and maximize output in any role. So like, I'm looking at my bookshelf and I would go back to like some of the classics on productivity or management or, you know, there's a couple great books that have titles that are like variations on, results without authority, influence without authority, or whatever. It's like how to lead projects when you're not the person in charge and there's no one reporting to you. Like, those are the sources of inspiration I would look to in that situation.
Can I push you? Because I don't think you answered my question.
Okay. Yeah, I might have had a totally tangential thought there.
I think everything you said is very good advice. The two things are like create allies and audit your time. Because like objectively, sage advice. Because if you're drowning in a bunch of work, I'm drowning in a bunch of work, look back and, you know, I hate time tracking.
Oh, me too. I'm horrible at it.
I hate it. It's the worst. But it is objectively good advice to be like, where are you spending the most amount of time? Because maybe there's some AI magic dust you could sprinkle on that. Or maybe not. But like, I think that's sage advice of like, audit yourself, figure out where are your chokes. Because if it's like, I'm spending, you know, let's say I'm spending 3 hours every time to create a test doc. That's a lot of time that maybe I don't have to spend as much time. Maybe it'll take me 10 hours to templatize it, and then that reduces my time to 1 hour and I gain. So I think that's sage advice. You also talk about allies. Totally. I talked with Nima about this. I think I've talked to every single person about this, and they're like, create allies. And I'm going to reinforce it that totally correct. Create allies, because the more people on your side backing up the thing that you're trying to do, which is experimentation, it's like a multi-pronged phased approach. Get more people attacking and talking about this thing, you'll create that cycle of positivity. But I did specifically ask you, what can we learn from big companies? So big companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Walmart, Booking, whatever. You talked about allies, you talked about time audits. Maybe there's something else, but I'll push you a little bit more, like specifically with big companies. What are some lessons that we could learn from your experience? You've worked with big companies. What are some of the behaviors, rituals, things that some of these bigger companies are doing? Maybe it's a process or it's just something to consider that we could internalize.
None of this is going to sound particularly or I hope this doesn't sound particularly groundbreaking. But like the first one that comes to mind is just get as many eyeballs on experiment results as possible. It doesn't need, like, they don't have to be wins. They could be surprising losses. They could be surprisingly flat. Like, hey, we thought this would move the needle and it didn't. Something that I certainly did when I was a consultant, something we do with customers at EPO all the time is like these in-person experimentation days. It's like you get the biggest room at the office possible if this is a team that's in office, or you get as many people on a Zoom call as possible. You come up with the most juicy, enticing, hot take, debatable, memorable tests possible. Spend some time putting them in nice slides so that it's visually engaging, and you show them off to people, and you make a cadence of doing that. And it's going to take persistence because maybe the first time no one shows up. But you do that at least quarterly. That's
By
really
the way,
important.
I think that relates to the allies piece. Like,
For sure.
the more you could get the allies that get designers excited, even if it's one designer, and then be like, hey, Chad, designer person, this is a name that I made up, but like, said, Chad, yo, can you bring a couple designers to this? I want to get more eyeballs on this. And like, that's where you create the allies and that support system. And when that number, like, when more of that number count goes up, it's a positive thing that more people will want to attend it.
Well, and the institutional knowledge is an important part of that, right? But even more so, like if we want to think selfishly, experimentation becomes part of the shared lore of the company, right? It's like, oh, you remember that time we tried XYZ and this was the outcome and we couldn't believe it and whatever, right? You're just kind of ingraining experimentation as part of the like shared narrative or identity of the company. Really powerful. The other things I would point to besides like the share outs is learn from their journeys as much as you can get into the backstory of how experimentation grew at these companies. There are, I think Lenny's podcast has done interviews with a bunch of ex-Airbnb people who all kind of shed light on this. You can find little nuggets like on the engineering blogs often, even when they're very technical topics are the focus of the post. There's usually an introduction and a conclusion section that said, here's why we decided to do this crazy complicated thing. Like this was a business question that was being brought to us. And then the conclusion, here's the outcome it had. Here's what we're thinking about exploring next. Like those are kind of instructive. You're probably not going to do the same thing, but it might encourage you to reach out to someone in a team or a department that you don't normally interface with and say, hey, Instacart did this crazy thing to optimize their marketing spend. I don't think we could do the same thing, but like maybe there's a way I could help you. I'm sure you have the same question. Maybe there's a way we could run some experiments to help you answer those. So look for like the narrative, not just the actual outputs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the engineering slant's so interesting. I know it's like Spotify's engineering blog
Sure.
I've been obsessed with because
Booking, Etsy.
Yeah, that one too. Yep.
Stitch Fix. Like these are all names, easy to find their engineering blogs. They write them as recruiting tools because they want to show off to other engineers and data scientists, here are the super cool problems that we're working on. But it is a great behind the scenes look at, beyond like UI, UX, here are the business problems where we are creating value by applying some flavor of experimentation. Those are more selling points that you can use internally. And then I guess last thought, look for the things that are counterintuitive because the big companies probably they've taken the at-bats, right? They're way further ahead of us. So when there is some counterintuitive truth, they're more likely to figure it out before us. So I'm thinking of a paper that Netflix just presented at the MIT Conference on Digital Experimentation. Super nerdy conference.
Yeah.
Like you could not get more esoteric and arcane and advanced than this conference. But
Your sentences have like a minimum 12 character count for each word.
it is a very dense 2 days. I love being there, but I understand 15% of the content and, super draining.
And you're a big brain, so that's...
Everyone calls me that. But the Netflix team presented a paper where they showed a couple different like hypothetical distributions of test outcomes, right? And they said, if any of these represented the real world, then a p-value of 0.05 would be the optimal way to make decisions, just based on trade-offs, costs, false positives, false negatives, whatever. Then they showed a very different distribution. They said, this is what our distribution of tests actually looks like at Netflix. It'd be pretty familiar to you and I. It's centered around 0. Small lifts more, regular than big lifts, but pretty equal on both sides of 0. They said they'd use all this fancy math, essentially decision theory and all this Bayesian thinking, to show that if this is true and their goal is to make their metrics go up as quickly as possible, then really they should test with a p-value more like 0.5 or 50% stat sig, if that's the way your tool reports on things. Basically saying, we don't think false positives are really that risky at all. What we're way more afraid of is not discovering a potential win, and we should be running 3 orders of magnitude more experiments than we are. Not that they can actually achieve that practically today. They are also resource constrained at some level, but like that's pretty counterintuitive, right? But this idea that like maybe what matters is taking more swings and the accuracy is a trade-off at some point. pretty counterintuitive, but an interesting idea and like worth considering.
Yeah. I don't know how much that I'm thinking of that example specifically. I'm like, I don't know how much I could specifically take away from that. But that doesn't mean like everything has to be a lesson. That could be an interesting thing that you learn about. You keep it in the back of your mind. But there are other things. It's better to absorb the information and understand what a lot of the bigger companies have done. So you keep it in the back of your mind, because that might be something you need to tap in 2 years when you're scaling the program or working things out.
I just take it as more evidence that, like, look, if you can solve for the cost per test thing and run more experiments, that's going to take care of a lot of other stuff. You can be suboptimal.
Is that your big enabler? I think so. I know we're kind of going full circle now, right? Like we kind of went off onto other stuff that wasn't explicitly spaghetti testing, but I do think it's good to bring it back in that your perspective is effectively just test as much as you possibly fucking can. And if you feel like you aren't able to do that, as much time as you can invest in making experiments cheaper on the effort side, just spend maybe, like hour a week, 2 hours a week, try and figure out time to hone in on that process to make experiments cheaper.
If you want to grow your career or have more allies, more people contributing ideas, helping you build tests, at some point, your job is going to become two things. One, managing that cost per experiment, and two, evangelizing that culture of experimentation across the company. A very big celebratory moment here. But that is the job at some, and yeah, there's like people management flavors to it too. But once there are a couple people involved in experimentation, you are no longer the expert on every area of the product, right? The designer is the expert on the design ideas, and the PM is the expert on the product feature experiments, and the engineers probably have some ideas for experiments for performance or whatever. Your job is no longer the arbiter of ideas. Your job is to keep that flywheel growing.
I do wonder, like, this is a whole other can of worms that I'm not going to go into right now, but I think that addresses the problem when resourcing is your limitation. But we talked about your example, like, making experiments cheaper isn't necessarily going to solve the problem if you have problematic stakeholders who, even with unlimited resources, they block shit. But that's not related to
necessarily... It's a different cost. And with a different solution. It's not a technical solution.
It's other solutions that maybe we don't go into because that's a whole can of worms. I had a couple other quick thoughts. I know we're really over time here before we jump into shit you need to know, but as you were talking about effectively like getting people excited about experimentation and like, what do we learn from some of the bigger companies about experimentation to grow when you're that solo CRO person drowning and all that stuff? I think like two things that really stood out to me is like guess the test, competitions with guessing. Because I think, well, as CROs, I personally kind of hate the idea of guessing because it does mean no value to guess. I have a hypothesis, we have data, guessing, and my guess rate is a meaningless statistic other than purely bragging, if that. But it's just random. But I do think that gets other people excited in creating internal competitions. Do you know of any companies like Microsoft or other companies that have had like competitions like that or something with guessing that has gotten people excited about experimentation?
Absolutely. I don't know about like how formal, but I think it's Ronnie who tells a story about like, going around to teams at Microsoft with a sample of 5 tests, asking everyone in the room to put their hands up, and as soon as they guessed one wrong, to put their hands down. And by the time he got to test 3 out of 5, not a single hand in the room was still up. And I think he does that in his Maven course too. Like, he starts with those 5, and just the point is to watch how quickly he fools everybody. That's absolutely a thing to do. That, and then the second piece of it is I guarantee there are people in your organization who are creative, they have ideas they're excited about, and they're just waiting for someone to enable them. Find those people, give them the toolkit they need. Even if you can only help them try 1 or 2 of their ideas, you will build allies that way.
Okay, well, I think that's a lot to take in here. I think it's probably time to jump over to the next section. So, Ryan, what is it time for?
Shit that you should know.
Let's go. All right, shit you need to know. This week comes courtesy of David Bland. Pretty short post, but I'll just have you kind of I'll just read the whole post. It's pretty short. So, a lot of debate on product discovery versus experimentation lately. Much of it depends on language and culture. As in David, I've been personally using words like uncertainty with people because it's very relatable, and I don't only focus on like the product. I'm also trying not to frame uncertainty in a negative light. Just because I have a hard time with uncertainty doesn't mean that others have the same view. The one thing that stood out to me was like the word uncertainty. And it's something that I haven't seen a lot of in experimentation. Maybe it's just my feed or whatever, LinkedIn, just my feed sucks or whatever. But like the word uncertainty gives off like a negative connotation in my view of like the future is uncertain. Like it feels like a negative word. But the reality is it's an objective word that just means certain is not. Like you are not certain, which doesn't have to be negative. And that's maybe associated with experimentation, that people almost associate testing with uncertainty in the negative. It's like, well, I am certain if we keep the status quo, we won't have a loser. But I am uncertain that if we run a test, it will win because it might lose, and that's bad. That's unknown. So I see a parallel, and maybe this wasn't his point, but that's kind of how I read it, as that's what got me thinking about it, is like uncertainty is seen as negative, and I think that's where sometimes experimentation, for others that are not in the space, is seen as a negative, when the reality is it's trying to add certainty to the uncertain.
Agreed. Very much so. Like, look, I'm no philosopher of science, but like, I kind of think that's the point of statistics, right? Is like, we are uncertain what will happen when we do this. So by using this experimental procedure, we're going to quantify our uncertainty around it. We'll never be 100% certain about it. Whether we choose to make frequentist or Bayesian inference, we're picking one way to say like, hey, we can narrow our uncertainty down to this range in one way or another. Like, I don't know what's going to happen when we give this medicine to everyone with diabetes. It's like, well, maybe let's run an experiment so we can quantify that uncertainty.
Usually a good idea to quantify rather than giving diabetics random shit and seeing what happens, i.e. spaghetti testing.
At the same time, what do you think drug discovery looks like, though? Like, we've already discovered so many drugs at this point.
True.
You have to just kind of chase different...
Ryan, we're trying to end this episode. We're not trying to...
This episode will be 3 hours long, and will somehow premiere on Joe Rogan or something instead of From A to B. I don't know what other long podcasts are.
This is perfect. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of From A to B. Do you have anything you want to plug? Any cool shit you're working on over at EPO, or just personal things you're working on?
No, I mean, look,
You're not working on anything cool?
Well, I'm working on a lot of top secret stuff.
Okay.
And by the time this episode airs, you know, like I might be working on an entirely different set of cool stuff. I will say there are a lot of smart folks, both at EPO and outside EPO, that all of my thoughts are derivative of in some way, shape, or form. So gotta like, you know, give credit where it's due. And I'll plug Outperform, which is kind of like our media platform for all this kind of thought leadership-y type stuff. Again, has authors from within EPO, outside of EPO. It's really not about EPO.
Well, I haven't been on it, so I don't know if I could plug it.
That's fair. We got to get you. We'll get you on there.
I'm a shit poster. I don't know if you want me on there.
Oh, I'm shit posting. Very welcome.
Ryan, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of From A to B. I really appreciate you taking the time, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.